Most modern people have never hired a porter. In fact, the vast majority of people likely don't even remember what a porter was. Porters were people hired specifically to carry things in an age before the invention of tractors, cars, and trucks. Nearly every major historical expedition, from the movement of armies to exploration expeditions, was backed by armies of porters who did the inglorious job of following behind the main host with arms full of goods. Porters worked for little pay and were often local people. Porters were frequently mistreated by their hosts, verbally berated and beaten, and were usually the first people left behind if things went wrong. But without these people, some of the greatest men in history would have never been able to accomplish the things that they did. From conquerors like Napoleon to explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, who once outfitted one of his exploration ventures with no fewer than 192 porters, few people would have been able to accomplish anything without average men doing menial tasks. Porters worked everywhere and were used as recently as World War II, in which local porters were instrumental in helping armies move critical supplies in far-flung theaters like New Guinea. Despite their contributions to the fields of science, exploration, and war-making, porters are rarely remembered. And that is a shame. Many of these men endured terrible conditions, worked hard, and made the lives of others better. Porters were hired by the dozens, or even hundreds, to carry the goods and belongings of various expeditions. Porters hauled everything from food and water to sensitive scientific instruments like sextants, chronometers, and barometers. Porters were strung out in long lines of people and were forced to walk in every condition, from freezing cold to scorching sun. They carried bags of food up mountains and hoofed barrels of water down steep ravines. In areas beset by persistent disease, porters were often tasked with carrying sick members via litter or hammock. Imagine hiking hundreds of miles while carrying someone besieged by malaria or typhoid fever within a litter. But porters were not simply human pack animals. They were also cooks, guides, and interpreters. A local porter who knew the landscape and the local people, either from personal experience or from previous expeditions, could be invaluable. When people read history, they often take for granted that long expeditions took thousands of pounds of supplies and materials in order to succeed. In order for an explorer to be in the field for weeks or months at a time, they would have to carry food and water for dozens of people that could sustain them day in and day out. Without porters hauling this stuff, expeditions would grind to a halt within a few days once the food and water ran out. Despite their contributions to major historical events, porters are largely forgotten. Since they were used in large numbers and taken for granted, individuals were never recognized, and the names of porters were never recorded. However, porters also gained a poor reputation for a number of reasons. Due to the poor conditions and pay, many porters were at risk of fleeing or deserting. In many cases, porters would simply drop their baggage and disappear into the wilderness when the expedition leaders slept. Porters were also prone to petty theft and fights among themselves. In one expedition, searching for the source of the Nile, John Speke was tasked with breaking up physical brawls and altercations on a near-daily basis between disgruntled porters. These types of behaviors were seen as the cost of doing business, as porters were a necessity during this time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, everyone would have been familiar with the idea of porters. In the late 20th century and 21st century, that is no longer the case. Porters have slowly been replaced by modern technology, such as cars, trucks, SUVs, and trains. Before there were roads, the only way to carry things long distances was by hand. Now, if you want to go on an expedition, you will likely outfit a rugged off-road vehicle. An SUV can carry a surprising amount of supplies. The growth of local road and rail networks has also made it much easier to get close to your final destination. In the past, people would likely start near the coast, at a port, or at the nearest rail terminal, but that could be hundreds of miles from their final destination with no roads between them and where they were trying to go. While portering is largely a lost art, there are still some modern examples to draw on. In one case, Human Rights Watch identified large-scale mistreatment of porters by the Myanmar military. Myanmar, formerly Burma, has been engulfed in an intense civil war and ethnic struggle for years. The army was accused of using convicts and empressing locals to carry goods, including ammunition, for the army. Over 1,200 such porters were used by the army in Myanmar over a decade ago, and used these men as human shields and as bait for enemy militants. The report reads in part, "The military uses the porters as human shields to draw fire from the opposition, to trip landmines, and to walk ahead to be shot first in an ambush. Civilians flee the area to avoid being taken as porters. And these porters are given little food and no medical care." In places like Myanmar, where infrastructure is poor and the terrain is rough, porters are still being used, and they are still being abused. It is fun and exciting to read about the biggest names in history and their greatest deeds. However, it is also prudent to occasionally stop and remember the regular people that history rarely does. Great men never succeed without large groups of regular people doing their best and working hard. We will never know who the thousands of porters were who worked hard in the past, but we know what their labor resulted in. Porters were often people from the margins, overlooked, mistreated, and poor. But they still managed to move history forward simply by being willing to work and willing to join up with people and forces that saw themselves as far greater than the people who carried their bags. And that is admirable. That is worth remembering.